The warm golden light of hundreds of crystal chandeliers poured over the vast space of Belvoir, where the faint clinking of silverware on porcelain and the gentle swirl of wine in glasses formed a symphony of luxury. In a secluded corner still striking because of its meticulous perfection, Alexander Grant sat with his back straight, clad in a flawlessly tailored Italian suit. Every stitch seemed to mirror the man himself, sharp, disciplined, and in absolute control. They said Alexander was the kind of man who could shift markets with a single phone call, who could sign a contract powerful enough to alter the future of an entire nation. But tonight, that power suddenly felt meaningless in this opulent room. Across from him, Ethan, an 8-year-old boy with deep blue eyes and soft blonde hair, sat in a red velvet chair. A silver fork lay untouched beside the plate of $200 seared salmon that had gone cold. He swayed in his seat, his small hands clamped tightly over his ears, as if to block out the smooth jazz weaving between the tables. Alexander leaned forward, his voice lowered, but each word stretched tight like a violin string on the verge of snapping. "Ethan, eat. People are watching." His eyes flicked over to the nearby tables. A well-dressed couple exchanged sympathetic glances, whispering into their sleeves. A middle-aged man frowned, sipped wine, and turned away. Alexander felt every gaze like an icy needle piercing straight into the pride of a man who was used to nothing but respect. He picked up the knife and fork, cutting the salmon into smaller pieces, trying to slide the plate closer to his son. But Ethan only turned his face away, his body closing in on itself, his breathing quick and shallow. Alexander knew well the sensory storm rising inside his boy, a storm he had no idea how to calm. Amid the hum of conversation and the background music, Alexander realized something: he could command a boardroom, negotiate with the most unyielding politicians, yet he couldn't get his son to take a single bite. And that truth, though, he'd grown accustomed to this helplessness over the years, still twisted in his pride like a blade. Ethan shook his head slightly, his gaze fixed on the tablecloth, as if the entire world had shrunk to the fine threads beneath his fingers. Alexander exhaled. He had tried everything from therapists charging hundreds of dollars an hour to the most advanced support tools. Every effort had ended in Ethan's silence. To the outside world, Alexander Grant was an invincible man. But here in this small corner of Belvoir, he was only a father desperately trying and failing to reach into his child's world. There are moments when money, power, and fame become brutally useless. Have you ever felt that? When you've done everything yet, the person you love most is still beyond your reach. If you have, perhaps you'd understand why Alexander's eyes, beneath all this glittering light, were heavy like a sky about to rain. And sometimes, all it takes is one unexpected moment, one unexpected person, to change everything. But right now, Alexander had no idea that a woman would walk in carrying something he had never possessed just a few minutes later, and that it would change both of their lives. Stay with this story if you've ever believed that just the right moment and person could alter the course of destiny. You can also leave a like or share a few words below. Who knows, maybe someone out there needs to hear a story about hope, love, and how one heart can unlock another. And if you want to follow the whole journey, hit follow so you won't miss what's coming next. Because sometimes the very thing we're searching for shows up where we least expect it. Dinner drifted in tense silence, like a piece of music abandoned halfway through. Alexander set down his fork, leaning back into his chair, his gaze idly drifting toward the glass windows, where the city lights shimmered like countless stars. Inside him, that familiar sense of defeat rose again, slow and heavy with each beat. It was then that a figure approached from the service counter. Naomi Carter, the young woman whose curls framed her face and whose warm brown skin seemed touched by the last light of sunset. A simple white uniform hugged her slender, yet steady frame, and her eyes, deep and still, looked as though they had witnessed more than the world was ready to tell. Naomi didn't hurry. Each step was unhurried, soft, as if she wanted to melt into the background music. When she reached Alexander's table, she didn't stand upright like the other servers. Instead, Naomi bent down slightly, lowering herself onto one knee beside Ethan's chair. The boy was still gently rocking, his small hands pressed firmly over his ears. Naomi didn't touch him, didn't say a word. She closed her eyes, letting her breathing fall into sync with Ethan's rhythm. And then she began to hum a melody. Twinkle, twinkle, little star, but not in the cheerful, familiar tone of childhood. Naomi sang it slower, the warm, low notes twining together, soft and tender. Instead of lifting the melody upward, she let it fall into delicate pauses, spaces where Ethan's rocking began to slow. From across the table, Alexander watched every detail, the way Naomi tilted her head at just the right angle so Ethan could see her without feeling pressured, and her hand rested lightly on her knee so as not to intrude on his safe space. After a moment, Naomi tilted her hand slightly and picked up the silver fork. Rather than immediately offering the salmon to Ethan, she rotated her wrist, gently tracing small circles in the air with the fork. No rush, no force. Just little loops mirroring the same motion Ethan had drawn with his finger on the tabletop. The boy's blue eyes hesitated, lifting from the tablecloth. Like light through rain, that flickering gaze landed on Naomi's hand. She kept humming, her hand moving patiently, as if they were inviting him into a secret game only the two knew. Then slowly, Ethan leaned forward. The fork paused, holding a salmon glistening faintly with lemon butter. And then he opened his mouth. Alexander felt as if he had been pulled from a long dream. He had seen therapists try everything: glowing toys, special apps, even lavish rewards, but never once had anyone gotten Ethan to eat so naturally. The boy chewed slowly, then swallowed. Not a single word was spoken, but his shoulders loosened and his hands fell away from his ears. Ethan glanced at Naomi again, as if to be sure she was still there, and took another bite. Alexander realized his heartbeat had quickened, not from shock, but from something else. Something like witnessing a door crack open, revealing a narrow path into the world he had spent years standing outside of. Naomi didn't seek his gaze or show a hint of triumph. She only smiled faintly at Ethan, as if at that moment the whole world consisted of just the two of them. When the boy finished the last bite, Naomi set the fork down gently, rose to her feet and adjusted her apron. Alexander wanted to ask how she had done it, but he stayed silent. Something about Naomi made him unwilling to shatter this moment with hurried questions. He watched her walk away, her graceful figure blending into the warm glow of the restaurant. Ethan returned to tracing circles on the tablecloth, but now his hand moved lightly, as though some invisible weight had been lifted. Alexander sat there, his glass of red wine still untouched, feeling lighter too. He didn't know who she was. I didn't know why a server could succeed when a team of specialists had failed. But Alexander knew one thing for sure: this was no coincidence. And somewhere deep in his mind, a question began to form. A question that would lead him to truths he never expected about himself, his son, and the woman who had just walked away from the table. When Alexander and Ethan left the restaurant that evening, the night wind swept through the cobblestone street, carrying the rich aroma of roasted coffee from the cafe across the way. Ethan clutched his father's hand tightly, not looking up, but his small hand no longer recoiled as usual. Alexander noticed this, and for a moment he felt he was holding onto a fragile thread, linking two worlds that had long been apart. But in the luxury car gliding through the brightly lit streets, his mind was filled with images of Naomi Carter. Her gentle voice, the way she twirled her wrist to draw circles in the air, and the stillness she carried. A kind of peace that no contract or power could ever buy. At that exact moment, Naomi sat in the small staff break room in another city corner. The old fluorescent light flickered against the peeling painted wall. She removed her white apron, hung it on a hook, and poured herself a glass of water. Her shoulders ached after a 10-hour shift, yet her mind lingered on the moment when Ethan's eyes had sought hers. She remembered that 10 years earlier, she hadn't been wearing a restaurant uniform, but a simple cream-colored dress standing before a whiteboard at the Hope Center. She was a young director back then, firmly believing that special education could change the world. Every day she welcomed children with wary eyes, hesitant voices, or complete silence, and little by little, she found ways to make them smile. Naomi had once believed that with enough love and patience, no door was impossible to open. But then one day, the funding termination letter arrived, ending everything. The reason just 4 words: not economically viable. And the name printed on the company letterhead was Grant Global. Naomi had sat for hours in the empty room staring at the small chairs devoid of children. The low tables, the boxes of crayons, and the soft rugs were still there, but the laughter had vanished. She kept the center's keys as a keepsake, even though she knew she would never use them again. Meanwhile, on the top floor of a glass tower, in the heart of the city 5 years earlier, Alexander Grant stood before a screen displaying profit indexes. The report showed that the special education division was operating at a loss. He hadn't hesitated long. Reallocate the budget to mainstream programs. Focus on what brings profit, he said, his tone decisive. In his mind, every decision was about numbers, not faces. Alexander didn't know that he would need the program he had signed away. And just a few years later, Naomi didn't realize that the man sitting in the corner of Belvoir that night was the one who had cut off the lifeline to the work she had loved more than anything else. Their worlds, which had seemed destined never to intersect, were slowly drawing closer, not because of a contract, but because of a little boy named Ethan. Ethan slept soundly in his room in the vast penthouse that night. Alexander stood by the window, looking at the city glittering with lights. He realized that the image of Naomi and the look in Ethan's eyes at dinner kept circling in his mind, refusing to leave. Something compelled him to learn more about her, a rare curiosity he hadn't felt for anyone outside of work in years. Across town, in a small rented apartment on the outskirts, Naomi opened a drawer and took out an old file folder. On the cover, the faded words read, Hope Center, Child Records. She turned the pages, her fingers pausing on a crude drawing by a boy who hadn't spoken for 2 years, but had sung on Christmas Day. A mix of longing and regret welled, but tonight, thinking of Ethan, she felt a small spark of light inside her. Neither of them knew that from the moment Naomi had knelt beside Ethan's chair, a chain of events had begun, events that would force them to face their pasts, and the wounds each had unknowingly caused the other. And tonight, in the stillness of these 2 parallel worlds, neither Alexander nor Naomi realized that a single fragile thread had begun to bridge the distance that had once seemed infinite between them. 3 days later, Alexander returned to Belvoir. No guests, no business meetings, just an evening for Ethan. This time he didn't book a table in the usual area. When the manager came out, Alexander was clear. I want a table in Naomi Carter's section. The manager looked momentarily surprised, but didn't ask questions. A few minutes later, Naomi appeared apron neat, her curls tied low. Her gaze paused briefly on Ethan before turning to Alexander. Good evening, Mr. Grant, she said, her voice as soft as a calm afternoon, without a trace of unnecessary formality. Ethan sat in his chair, still showing signs of guardedness. His shoulders slightly hunched, one hand touching the table's edge. Naomi didn't rush to ask questions or lean in. She set the menu down, but her eyes stayed on Ethan as if listening for the rhythm of a silent song. When the food arrived, Alexander instinctively reached for the fork, but Naomi shook her head. "Let me try a different way." She said she was not seeking permission like an outsider, but asking as if to a father looking for an ally. Alexander nodded slowly. Naomi lowered her voice almost to a whisper. "For Ethan, light and sound can be walls. We need to open a small window." She gently tilted the screen of Alexander's phone, turning off the flashing light that danced across the table. Then, instead of calling Ethan's name directly, she moved around to his side, placing her eyes within his natural line of sight. "Hello, Ethan," she said, her tone low and slow, like steady rain on a roof. The boy didn't turn his head, but his rocking slowed. Naomi didn't miss the moment. She picked up a spoon, scooped a small bite, and set it down on a side plate right in front of him, not pushing it closer, not touching him. "We'll leave the food here. When you're ready, it will be waiting." Alexander watched in silence. He realized every move Naomi made had purpose. Nothing wasted, nothing rushed. Each gesture was like an unspoken sentence, yet somehow Ethan heard it in his way. 5 minutes passed before Ethan's eyes flicked to the side plate. His small hand shifted slightly. Naomi kept her distance, but rotated her wrist, so that the spoon angled toward where Ethan was looking, as if handing him the choice. Ethan touched the spoon and lifted it to his mouth. The first bite disappeared in silence, but Alexander saw the change in that quiet. His son's hands no longer tense, his shoulders lowering slightly, his breathing more even. Naomi smiled a discreet smile, not seeking acknowledgement. "See," she said softly to Alexander, "sometimes we only need to speak by being silent at the right moment." Alexander blinked. He had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on specialists, yet no one had ever spoken to him about the power of a pause. The meal ended without a drop of sweat, without a raised voice, without strain. Ethan leaned back in his chair, eyes half closed, as if he'd just spent a gentle afternoon. When Alexander paid the bill, Naomi nodded, instead of offering a formal farewell. But as he stepped out the door, he realized he had learned more than just a trick to get his son to eat. He had taken his first steps into an unspoken language, where every glance, every breath, every pause carried meaning. And that language, he knew, was one for which Naomi held the key. On weekend evenings, Belvoir felt like a dazzling stage, where every diner seemed dressed as if ready for a magazine photo shoot. Warm golden lights poured down onto the tables, wine glasses shimmered, and laughter mingled with the clink of cutlery against porcelain, composing an upper-class symphony. In the corner of the room, Alexander and Ethan once again sat at Naomi's table. Since Ethan had eaten under her care the first night, Alexander had almost exclusively chosen this spot. None of them ever spoke it aloud, but a quiet routine had formed between them, as if it were the only safe place in a noisy world. In her crisp white uniform, Naomi always greeted them with an unshowy smile. She patiently helped Ethan try new foods, or let him savor familiar ones at his own pace. From across the table, Alexander observed and learned. Sometimes he tried tilting his head the way she did, or softening his voice, and he noticed Ethan responding positively. But not everyone at Belvoir appreciated this particular stillness. Some diners began whispering, "Why was a server spending so much time at a single table?" A few discreetly lifted their phones and snapped pictures. Those photos, paired with captions full of speculation, soon made their way onto social media. Just days later, the tabloids blared provocative headlines. Billionaire Alexander Grant and the mysterious waitress. A relationship beyond the restaurant. When money can't buy a child's love, who is training the grand heir. The candid long-distance shots showed Alexander, Ethan, and Naomi seated together, the warm golden light casting the scene in the glow of an intimate family dinner. In the glass-walled office of Grant Global, Alexander scrolled past the articles with a cold expression, but his gaze lingered on the photo of Ethan smiling at Naomi. He knew exactly what the media was doing, poking at the void in his private life to drive clicks. But he didn't expect this story to reach the one person he least wanted to face, Victoria Hale. In Monaco, Victoria sat on a marble-tiled balcony, champagne in hand, the Mediterranean sun glinting off her flawless glossed lips. When her assistant handed her an iPad with the latest headlines, the corner of her mouth curved into a thin smile. A waitress. She tilted her head, her tone laced with disdain. Has he truly lowered himself this far? The assistant stayed silent. Victoria set her glass down, turning her chair toward the sea, though her eyes never left the screen. Prepare the paperwork, she said slowly. We'll file a lawsuit to regain custody of Ethan. This environment is entirely unsuitable. At Belvoir, Naomi had no idea those photos had become kindling for a fire. She worked as usual, but a few colleagues had shifted in their demeanor longer. Glances, shorter words. The manager called her into the office, his tone polite, but his meaning unmistakable. Naomi, VIP guests are always important, but you must divide your time fairly among other tables. There have been complaints. Naomi only nodded, offering no argument. But as she returned to the dining room, her eyes instinctively sought out the familiar table. Ethan was spooning soup, and Alexander was watching quietly. When he saw her, the boy's eyes lit up just a little, as if he had found his anchor. Alexander, too, noticed the subtle changes around them. Unfriendly glances, whispers breaking off when Naomi bent to meet Ethan's eye level. He said nothing, but inside a quiet instinct to protect had begun to take root. Beyond those walls, social media kept spinning, the story embellishing it, turning it into morning cafe gossip. And far away, thousands of miles from Belvoir, Victoria Hale was drafting the first lines of her plan to pull her son back into her arms, not out of love, but out of the pride and control she believed she deserved. Alexander didn't know. Naomi didn't suspect, but the undercurrent had risen, and when it finally broke, they could not hold on to the fragile peace they had found in that small corner of Belvoir. It was an autumn evening, the air carrying a faint chill, and the scent of damp wood from early rains. Belvoir wasn't as crowded as usual, and the jazz music drifting from the piano in the corner was softer, like a whisper that didn't wish to break the stillness. Alexander walked in with Ethan, and their eyes went straight to the table where Naomi usually stood, as if by instinct, a habit already becoming second nature. She greeted father and son with a warm smile, but Alexander noticed something different. There was a faint shadow under her eyes and slower steps, and when she set down the menus, her fingers trembled slightly. Dinner unfolded in its familiar rhythm. Naomi was still patient in guiding Ethan, adjusting the light, the sound, and the pauses, so he could take everything in without becoming overwhelmed. But there were moments when Alexander caught her gaze drifting away just for a beat before quickly returning to the present. Ethan, however, was different from usual. He ate slowly, but with more focus, occasionally glancing up at Naomi, as if weighing something in his mind. Ethan suddenly stopped when Naomi leaned forward to place another side plate before him. His small hand reached out, touching Naomi's hand. The touch was light, yet certain, as if wanting to hold her there. Naomi froze, her eyes widening in that moment. Mama Naomi, hungry. The voice was hoarse, hesitant, but clear enough for Alexander to hear. He almost couldn't believe his ears. It had been 2 years since he had heard Ethan call anyone anything more than a few scattered words, and never, not once, had the boy called someone by a name that carried such familiarity. Naomi gently squeezed his small hand, trying to hide the tears that threatened to rise. "All right, sweetheart. We'll have some more then." Alexander sat there looking at the two hands, large and small, clasped together in the warm golden light. Something inside him cracked like a thick wall that had stood too long, now breaking from within. He wasn't just seeing a woman helping his son eat. He saw a part of Ethan's world, a part he had never entered yet, one Naomi had been invited into, naturally. For the rest of that dinner, Alexander spoke less. He listened more, not just to the rare sound of Ethan's voice, but to the shared silences. Every gesture from Naomi carried an understanding, as though she and Ethan shared a language he was only beginning to learn. When the meal ended, Naomi walked them to the door. Ethan unexpectedly turned back, stepped closer, and wrapped his arms around her waist. Alexander stood a few steps away, watching the scene, as though it were confirmation that Naomi was no longer just the waitress in his son's mind. Ethan sat quietly in the car, but his small hand rested on Alexander's knee. The father knew that the moment they had just experienced would stay with him long, and from that very second, he understood that this bond between Naomi and Ethan had crossed every boundary of role, status, or background. He couldn't have known that the name Mama Naomi would soon become the focal point of a far greater battle, pulling all three of them into a storm none could have foreseen. But right now, in the quiet car gliding through the nighttime streets, Alexander knew only one thing. Hope had taken the shape of a person for the first time in years. The news about Mama Naomi didn't stop at social media. Within just a week, a slew of tabloid outlets began exploiting the story, even crafting entire scenarios about the relationship between the notorious billionaire Alexander Grant, the black waitress, and the autistic boy. Every article featured the same photo: Ethan hugging Naomi under Belvoir's warm golden lights. And then the story flew to Monaco, straight into the hands of Victoria Hale. Victoria carefully set down her espresso cup in her marble-tiled penthouse, reading the article in full, with a faint smile. Those pale blue eyes, once enough to captivate Alexander, now gleamed with cold calculation. "He's weaker than I thought," she said into the phone to her lawyer, her voice drawn out as though savoring an early victory. "A child left in the care of a waitress. We're going to take back custody of Ethan." Just days later, Alexander's law firm received an official notice. Victoria had filed a petition to change custody, citing an unsuitable environment and excessive attachment to an outsider with no blood relation or legal responsibility. Alexander sat in the glass-walled conference room, holding the thick case file. The lead attorney, Mr. Preston, looked him directly in the eye. "They're going to turn this into an issue of class and race, Alexander. They'll say you're exploiting Naomi Carter, that she's a server being forced to perform the duties of a specialist without proper pay. And more importantly, they'll smear both of you to weaken your custody claim." Alexander tightened his grip on the pen, signing the work brief without saying a word. But inside, a tide was rising. He knew Victoria knew she would exploit every crack she could find. Alexander went to Belvoir that evening, but Naomi wasn't there. The manager explained briefly, "She's taken a few days off." No further questions were needed. Alexander understood whatever storm was brewing outside had already reached her. At that moment, Naomi was in her small suburban apartment. Her phone kept vibrating with messages from friends and former colleagues, along with links to the articles. A few cruel comments had already surfaced. "She's clinging to the rich boss, just a money grab." She switched off her phone, leaned against the wall, and closed her eyes. What worried Naomi wasn't the slander she'd endured, prejudice all her life, but Ethan. How would the boy fare if everything were disrupted? Across the city, Alexander sat in his study, legal documents spread across his desk. Mr. Preston was right. The only way to protect Ethan's custody was to create distance from Naomi, at least for now. But when he thought of it, the image of Ethan's small hand resting on Naomi's came back to him. He knew that if he pulled Naomi from his son's life, he would be destroying the only bridge connecting Ethan to the world. That night, he didn't sleep. In his mind, a plan began taking shape, not just to win in court, but to keep what Victoria wanted to steal intact. Meanwhile, after a long day of avoiding the eyes of the world, Naomi opened her window to the night breeze. From her small apartment, she looked up at the stars glittering above the city. Deep inside, she hoped that Alexander would find a way, and Ethan would somehow not have to lose the peace he had just found. But neither knew that the coming days would bring the most significant test yet to their fragile bond, and the old wounds each still kept hidden. And this battle, once begun, would leave no way back. That morning the courtroom was packed. White light from the tall windows spilled cold and solemn onto the glossy wooden floor. In the back rows, the muted tones of expensive coats were broken by the black bulk of photographers' cameras. The air was thick with the scent of paper ink and a tense silence that felt like a taut string waiting for someone to cut it. Alexander sat at the defendant's table, his broad shoulders framed by a dark gray suit. Beside him, Attorney Preston went over his notes one final time. Across from them, Victoria Hale appeared, as if she had stepped straight off a magazine cover. An ivory skirt suit, silver stiletto heels, a thin smile like a blade hidden in silk. The hearing began with the plaintiff's opening statement. The lawyer's voice was steady, each sentence like a needle aimed directly at Alexander. Your Honor, my client believes that young Ethan Grant is living in an unstable environment. His father, Mr. Alexander Grant, has delegated much of the child's care to a restaurant server, someone with no blood relation, no therapy license, and no official role within any recognized support system. Each word seemed designed to plant an image in the listeners' minds. Alexander as negligent, Naomi Carter as an opportunist. When Naomi was called to the stand, the click and flash of cameras echoed off the four walls. She walked up in low black flats and a simple dress, her curls tied neatly at the back of her head. The light caught her warm brown skin, but her eyes remained calm and steady, like deep water. Victoria's attorney stepped forward. Ms. Carter, it's true that you are currently employed at Belvoir as a waitress, correct? Yes, and it's also true that you have spent significant private time with Mr. Grant's son, even allowing the boy to call you Mama Naomi. That's correct. He arched an eyebrow, as though he had gotten the hoped-for answer. Do you believe that's appropriate, given you are neither family nor hired in any professional caregiving capacity? Naomi looked directly at him, then shifted her gaze to the bench. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried enough for every person in the room to hear. I have a master's degree in special education from Columbia University. For 8 years, I ran the Hope Center, a place that helped over 200 children with autism, ADHD, and other developmental disorders learn to communicate, build trust, and see their worth. The room seemed still. Naomi went on, each word deliberate, as if engraving them into the air. That center closed when it lost its funding. And the company that cut that funding was Grant Global. Alexander felt the blood drain from his face. He had known Naomi once worked in education, but he had never known this detail. Naomi didn't look his way. She addressed the judge. So when I met Ethan, I knew I was looking at a child who had been denied the same opportunities I had spent my life creating for others. I knew how to make him feel safe. I knew how to get him to eat when for months no one else could. Not because I was being paid to do it, but because it's what I have always done, whether anyone paid me or not. Then she turned toward Victoria. Ethan calls me Mama Naomi because I am the first person who has seen him as a gift, not a burden. No one spoke. The only sound was the scratch of the court clerk's pen on paper. At the defense table, Alexander felt a sharp ache in his chest, not just from emotion, but a slow burning shame. He remembered the years before when he had signed the budget cuts without a second thought, thinking only of economic efficiency and not of faces like Naomi's or Ethan's. The hearing continued with a few more questions, but the atmosphere had shifted. Many eyes in the gallery now looked at Naomi, not with curiosity or judgment, but with quiet respect. When she stepped down, Alexander rose to let her pass. Their eyes met for the briefest moment, just long enough for Naomi to see that this time, he looked at her not only as his son's savior, but as a piece of the truth he had taken far too long to face. And Alexander knew that no matter the trial's outcome, one thing was sure. Naomi hadn't just defended Ethan against judgment. She had, without meaning to, defended him as well, from the very indifference he had once mistaken for strength. The ruling came faster than Alexander expected. The judge struck the gavel, voice firm. Custody of Ethan Grant will remain with Mr. Alexander Grant, but on the condition that a professional support plan be established, including therapy, individualized education, and family counseling. A low murmur rippled through the courtroom. Victoria's smile cracked for the briefest moment on the plaintiff's bench, before she quickly masked it with composure. Alexander didn't look her way. He turned to Preston and received a confirming nod. The legal battle was temporarily over, but what he needed to do next was what truly mattered. Stepping out of the courthouse, the daylight made Alexander squint. At the foot of the stone steps, he saw Naomi, sitting alone, her back resting against a column, her shoulders lowered from fatigue. Her simple black dress fluttered slightly in the breeze, her curls a little tousled, but her eyes held the same steady focus and resolve that had quieted the courtroom. Alexander approached. She looked up at the sound of his steps, those deep brown eyes resting on him, neither guarded nor welcoming. "I owe you an apology," he said, his voice low but certain. Naomi stayed silent, letting the wind pass through the space between them. "I'm sorry for what my company did. I signed a decision that took away your work, your dream, and the opportunities for the children you loved. I didn't think, or maybe I didn't want to think, that my son would be one of those children one day." Naomi's gaze dropped to the stone steps, the gray veins in the rock reflecting a part of their story, cold yet enduring. "You're sorry, but 8 years can't be undone," she replied, her voice soft like a knife that didn't need to be raised. Alexander nodded. He knew any justification now would be meaningless. But there was still one thing he couldn't leave unsaid. "I want you to lead a new project, not at Belvoir and not working for me, but for all the children like Ethan." Naomi looked up, her brows knitting slightly. "I want to create the Grant Neurodevelopment Foundation. The first facility will be in the old Hope Center building. You'll be the director. Full authority, unlimited budget, everything you once dreamed of for those children. You'll be able to do again this time, without fear of being cut off." Naomi studied him for a long moment. In her eyes, Alexander could see the struggle between a trust once shattered and a glimmer of hope trying to find its way back. "Why?" she asked. Alexander didn't hesitate. "Because Ethan isn't the only child who needs you. And you aren't the only one who can give them what the world has forgotten." His words fell into the quiet between traffic and the wind curling around the steps. Naomi lowered her gaze, clasping her hands together. He didn't press her, just stood there waiting for her answer, as though he had learned that sometimes silence was the only thing that could open a door. Finally, Naomi exhaled a deep breath, as if pushing out a weight she'd been carrying. I'll think about it, she said, then stood. Their eyes met for a slow beat, and Alexander realized that even without agreement, at least he had planted a seed. That seed he knew would need more than promises and budgets. It would require patience, honesty, and moments of humility, things a man like him hadn't practiced in far too long. And as Naomi turned and walked down the stone steps, Alexander stood there watching her go, telling himself that this time, he would not let another opportunity slip away. 6 months later, the sky stretched in a pale, translucent blue on a spring morning as light as a breath. The small, tree-lined street that had once been the address of the Hope Center now buzzed with laughter and footsteps. Once silent behind a locked door, the old building wore a new face, bright open, with a metal sign gleaming in the sunlight. Grant Neurodevelopment Foundation. Naomi stood in the main hall, wearing a soft teal dress, holding a stack of files and a long list of therapy sessions for the children. Around her, the air was filled with the sounds of children, not perfectly neat, but alive and real. There was bright laughter, soft humming, the whir of small wheelchair wheels, and the uneven sounds that only those who understood could recognize as a child's, saying, "I'm here." Ethan sat in a corner, stacking wooden blocks into the shape of a house, its roof made from red tiles. Alexander sat beside him, not just watching as he once did, but taking part, placing the wall pieces together and waiting for Ethan's signal before setting them down. "Do you want the roof higher?" Alexander asked softly. Ethan nodded, his blue eyes sparkling. Naomi paused at the sight, her lips curving into a smile she didn't bother to hide. She still remembered the early days when Alexander was clumsy, his voice too forceful, his gaze fixed on quick results. Now, he knew how to pause, wait for his son to choose, and match the rhythm his son wanted. It wasn't just Ethan's progress, but the father's transformation. A little later, Ethan left the play corner for a snack. Naomi had a plate ready with soft bread and slices of fruit. The boy sat down, feeding himself spoonful by spoonful without needing a reminder. Alexander sat beside him, gently swinging his leg in time with the beat. Ethan tapped on the table. "You've created a truly safe place." Alexander said, a note of admiration in his voice. "Not just for Ethan, but for fathers like me too." Naomi laughed lightly, but didn't respond. Sunlight streamed through the large glass window, catching in her curls and making them glint like threads of gold. Alexander glanced at her, recognizing the feeling, the sense of standing before something so precious. He just wanted to hold the moment still. That day, the foundation hosted an outdoor activity for the children. Everyone headed to the backyard, where swing slides and a painting corner had been set up. Naomi directed the volunteers, while Alexander helped Ethan choose colors. Instead of drawing a house as usual, Ethan painted 3 figures standing under a star-filled sky this time. Beneath the picture, he carefully wrote, "Daddy, Mama, Naomi, and Ethan." Alexander froze when he read it, then looked over at Naomi, who was crouched tying the shoelace of another child. He said nothing, but when their eyes met, his gaze held a quiet thank you of the deepest kind. By the end of the day, when all the children had gone home, Naomi and Alexander stayed behind to tidy up the room. The setting sun filtered in, bathing the space in warm gold. Ethan busied himself by putting toys away in a far corner, while the two stood closer than usual in a silence that felt like it was waiting for something. Naomi Alexander began slowly. "I used to think the only thing I could give Ethan was protection. But I've realized you're the one who's given him a connection. And me too." Naomi set the stack of books on a shelf, then turned with a gentle smile. "We've both changed, Alexander. No one does this alone." He said nothing, only looked at her, his gaze deep and thoughtful. Then, as if afraid the moment would slip away, Alexander lightly placed his hand over hers. He didn't grip it just a touch enough to say he was grateful, sufficient to say he didn't want this bond ever to break. Ethan came running over holding up his finished painting, 3 figures, a sky full of stars, and a single word written beneath family. He looked up, eyes waiting for approval. "It's beautiful, son," Alexander said softly, his voice catching. Naomi bent down to hug Ethan, her hair brushing lightly against Alexander's shoulder. In that moment, the 3 stood close together, as if the space that had once separated them had never existed. As Alexander drove the 2 of them, mother and son, as he now thought of them in his heart through the city streets, the lights had already come on that evening. The reflections shimmered on the glass, showing the image of 3 people in the car. Alexander realized that after years of living between power and emotional emptiness, he had finally found a true home. And if you're hearing this story, perhaps you believe, as I do, that sometimes family isn't made by blood, but by the moments we choose to stay together. Leave a few words to share if you've ever found yourself in this story, in the waiting hope or moment of being truly seen. Who knows? Your story might be the light someone else needs to find their way. Because just like the star-filled sky in Ethan's painting, every genuine connection we make can be a star guiding someone forward. And you'll never know whose life your light might illuminate until you let it shine.